28 years later is finally happening, but the film would have been very different if 28 weeks later had stuck to its original sequel plan. 28 Weeks Later was the first sequel to the hit zombie film 28 Days Later, and while the second film in the series was a success upon its release in 2007, it has taken over a decade for another sequel to get announced. 28 Years Later has been officially confirmed, however, and while details on the film are still slim, the original direction of 28 Weeks Later would have changed absolutely everything. 28 Years Later is the third film in the 28 Days Later franchise, with it taking an even greater leap into the future and exploring the ramifications of the rage virus outbreak nearly 30 years down the road. 28 Years Later is meant to launch a new trilogy, potentially taking the franchise decades or even centuries into the future. Danny Boyle and Alex Garland are confirmed to be involved in the first chapter of this new zombie trilogy, causing some fans to cross their fingers that Cillian Murphy will return, even though he didn't for 28 Weeks Later. 28 Weeks Later was originally not a direct sequel. 28 Weeks Later in its final form takes place 28 weeks after the initial outbreak, exploring London months down the road as uninfected humans begin to move back in after the rage virus has been cleared out of a quarantine zone. Although Cillian Murphy and the original cast of 28 Days Later aren't involved in the sequel, 28 Weeks Later is a direct sequel, building off of the setups and world building that was present in the first film. However, this wasn't always the plan, as the 28 Days Later sequel wasn't originally meant to function in this way. According to the DVD commentary, 28 Weeks Later wasn't initially supposed to take place that long after the sequel, with it instead taking place adjacent to the timeline of the original film. Although details on what this story could have been aren't given, it can be assumed that the original 28 Days Later sequel would have followed another group of survivors shortly after the initial outbreak, or possibly even during the chaos surrounding the first rage virus infections. The story of 28 Weeks Later is a major departure from this, causing some fans to wonder what could have been. 28 Years Later would have been immensely different if 28 Weeks Later had stuck with this initial plan, as 28 Weeks Later sets up several storylines that 28 Years Later will presumably build off of. 28 Years Later shows the US government losing control of London and the infection going international, with 28 Years Later's new trilogy being set up by the virus reaching Paris at the end of the second film. 28 Weeks Later also hints that the zombies are getting smarter, with an infected Don following his kids, something that the new trilogy should also continue. 28 Weeks Later's original plan wouldn't have worked. Although it is interesting to ponder what the original 28 Days Later sequel could have been like, these early plans for 28 Weeks Later simply wouldn't have worked. Much of the appeal of 28 Days Later is the fact that Cillian Murphy's character is walking through an empty London near the beginning of the film, with him being alone for a good chunk of the movie. The original 28 Days Later sequel showing that other survivors are going through major events in London would have made these scenes less believable, retroactively taking away from the charm of the original movie. On top of that, the world 28 days after the rage virus outbreak had already been explored, meaning that this original sequel plan would have been nothing more than a rehash of the first movie. Exploring the world months after the initial rage virus outbreak is a much more logical choice for a sequel, with it building on top of the foundation of the original film by introducing all kinds of new elements.